And a very good afternoon to you again on the 17th of April, 2024. Welcome to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, broadcasting from Melbourne, Australia. Greetings to all of you, wherever you are in the world. We are continuing our series on the Macedonian question, and in particular, the scholarly publication by Professor Dr. Igor Yanev titled The Prespa Agreement as a Cultural Genocide of the Macedonian National Identity towards the termination of an illegal treaty. This publication came out in late 2023, so only a few months ago. You may recall earlier we did a segment, and it was the segment chapter 5.2, I should say, and it was part 2. So I'm now going to continue with part 3. I think there are more than 3 parts. Yes, so we shall see. Let's do part 3. Professor Igor Yanev's scholarly publication, which we are able to bring to you with his permission. Despite all the legally limited speaker's powers, remember that the person, Talat Jaferi, the speaker, but despite his limited powers to dismiss and block a referendum initiative, which was put together by the opposition party, VMRO de Permanent, and a vague or an apparently odd interpretation of the Constitution. He interpreted it, even though he's not a legal, he hasn't got a legal background given by himself. Yes, alone, says the professor, we still may draw a conclusion that the question placed for the referendum vote, which we read to you earlier today, was indeed unprofessionally formulated by VMRO and the party Levica as well. A law for the ratification of treaties generally only provides that international treaty become the law of the land. And it appears that it's not sufficiently clear what happens when ratification is rescinded or revoked. In Article 13, paragraph 1 of the treaty with Bulgaria from 2017, it was provided that, quote, this treaty is subject to ratification in accordance with the constitutional requirements of the contracting parties. Now, we know the contracting parties are the Republic of Macedonia and the Republic of Bulgaria. This treaty will enter into force on the date of the exchange of the instruments of ratification of both contracting parties and will remain in force for an indefinite period of time. An indefinite period of time. End of quote. However, revocation of ratification was never subject matter of international treaties. And thus Bulgaria, as the contracting party, may, for instance, interpret in case of domestic nullification that the other contracting party to the treaty is unwilling and unable to implement some of the obligations from the treaty. Those cease to be part of the domestic law, but other of an international character, or essentially all of them, may still be in force. Therefore, the international community and Bulgaria as a treaty party could only consider such judicial nullification of the ratification as a breach of contractual obligations, using the court's ruling as a tool or bluntly an absence of a will to fulfill them. For Bulgaria and the international community, it's entirely irrelevant fact that the Constitutional Court in court provided a precedent for nullification in 2002, since the treaty in 2017 has only provided one mode of the termination of the mutual international obligations. Apparently, VMRO DPMNE, this is the opposition party, didn't take into consideration that the legal aspect, that legal aspect, and it also appears that no one in the among the international lawyers, none of them were consulted when drafting the question for the referendum. Really? How could that be so? None of them were consulted when drafting the question for the referendum. What happened there? I would like to know. I'm sure you do too. From a political angle, that is the perspective analyzing the flow of events, the opposition in Macedonia actually demonstrated a low capacity to foresee the political events, such as the rejection maneuver of the president parliament, the Jaferi man, the Albanian, with respect to the drafted question for the referendum vote. VMRO DPMNE was in fact caught stunned and with no answer or response to that developing event. Isn't that amazing? What was happening with them, I wonder? The leader of VMRO, Mickoski, gave the reaction on the rejection of the referendum, saying that, in quote, if this is indeed confirmed, then they sacrifice further deterioration of the relations between the government and the opposition. And I warn that the only responsible for that will be the government. The only party responsible for that will be the government in these difficult times because it does not show democratic capacity, end of quote. Despite that threat delivered by Mickoski, nothing happened. Neither the Speaker of the Parliament, Jaferi person, changed his position, nor, quote, the deterioration of the relations was an outcome. So, as we may conclude at this point, says the professor, VMRO DPMNE was outmaneuvered by the Social Democratic Party, the SDSM, the ruling party, but not only that one, the other ruling party, which is in coalition, still is with the ruling party currently, DUI, once again. Essentially, VMRO DPMNE at the very starting point didn't properly estimate the prospects for validity of the referendum, which as pointed above, due to a high threshold census that is requiring 50% turnout, would most certainly fail. Secondly, the leadership of the VMRO, after a month of deliberation with all available so-called experts, proved to be with little to no capacity to formulate the proper question for people's referendum. I find that amazing. Couldn't they turn to the diaspora, maybe? Consult with them. We might have been in a position to give them some of our opinions and wisdom. In addition, VMRO DPMNE showed essentially no capacity to overthrow the unsuccessful or the puppet government of the SDSM, despite all its failures from economic disaster to COVID-19 management and catastrophic energy mismanagement. All efforts of the VMRO DPMNE to overthrow the unsuccessful government has not borne any fruit or yield any benefit, says the professor. After and during the campaign for referendum, that is the initiative VMRO, blamed mainly the European Union for taking side or being biased. However, VMRO's criticism was not a radical to the EU conditioning, and it looked more like begging for a session in the EU. Vice President of VMRO, A. Nikolovsky, gave, for instance, a weak statement of criticism against the EU policies and the discrimination of Macedonia. Quotation, Bulgaria has been vetoing the start of the European Union accession negotiations with Macedonia for years, The Macedonians demand the same treatment from the EU as it granted to other member states which have already joined the bloc. End of quote. A fiasco of the policies of VMRO party and the entire opposition to overthrow the apparently puppet government of the SDSM has been, to some extent, an outcome of the bias policies of the EU, indeed, and a strong EU support for the government of the SDSM. Some people refer to as the fascist apartheid policies of that government in power, still currently, unfortunately. For instance, recent support of French ambassador, by the way, mentioning that was my commentary, Silvana, not in the paper from the professor, making sure we are clear on what we are talking about here. For instance, recent support of French ambassador in Bulgaria, Florence Robin, in favor of the Bulgarian assimilation policy speaks itself for misunderstanding of the EU with respect to the illegality of the Bulgarian and the EU demands. French ambassador in Bulgaria confirmed the absolute EU support for Bulgaria for its extremist plans, and at the same time, encouraging Macedonian government to provide new disgraceful constitutional status for Bulgarians without any logical argument for constitutional revision or consideration of Macedonian national interests, which appears to be non-existent in the view of France and the EU. Well, you can now hear it loud and clear what the professor is saying on whose side are members, major members of the European community. Belgium, was it Belgium? The French? Yeah. The ambassadors representing those countries stating clearly what their position is and trying to convince Macedonia to do what is detrimental to the Macedonian state and its people. Quote, we gave European guarantees that including the Bulgarians in the Macedonian constitution will be a prerequisite for continuing the talks with Macedonia. Now, who are they, ambassadors, to be giving guarantees? And what form is this guarantee? Is it on paper anywhere? Or is this verbal information here say they're giving guarantees? Who are they to be giving guarantees? And did anybody ask them to give guarantees? I mean, this is quite annoying, wouldn't you say? Who are they to decide whether Macedonia should include so-called Bulgarians allegedly living in Macedonia to be included in the Macedonian constitution? And it will be a prerequisite. So it's an ultimatum. Do you see what Professor is talking about? They are actually giving conditions to the Macedonian government and the Macedonian people and all those other ethnic minorities residing in Macedonia, a prerequisite, a condition for continuing the talks with Macedonia on whether Macedonia will start negotiations with the European Union in regard to their intention to join the European Union. On whose side are they? It is clear on whose side they are. It is unbelievable. It begs belief. I, as an outsider who doesn't reside in Macedonia, nevertheless follows all the current affairs and goings on, and I'm sure you too, who are living abroad in the diaspora and in Macedonia and the occupied parts of Macedonia, namely the Macedonia which is occupied by Bulgaria and Greece, you can see on whose side the European Union is and what are they actually doing. I mean, this seems like a premeditated, pre-planned action, and they found friends amongst the ruling party, the ruling government in Macedonia, including that person I named, the Albanian, the Speaker of the Parliament. He's not the Speaker of the Parliament at present because they are in election mode. Come the 8th of May, there will be presidential and parliamentary elections. And we hope that everything will be in accordance with the law, and there won't be any interference from the United States of America and the ambassador in Macedonia, nor any interference from the European Union and the Commission headed by Ursula von der Leyen, or any other party whose intentions are really exceptionally negative towards Macedonia and the people of Macedonia. I wonder what it is that is driving them. What is it that they are afraid of? What is it they are hiding? Why all this organized effort to, one, change the flag, to change the name of the country to something that is absolutely ludicrous and exceptionally offensive to the Macedonian people? Why are they doing that? Can somebody answer? Is anybody listening to this YouTube in the European Union and the Commission and those up there in Kale, in Macedonia? Yeah, so this is part of the so-called French proposal. Well, there was never ever French proposal, was there? Silvana providing you with commentary now. There was always the European Commission proposal via the so-called French proposal, but really it was the Bulgarian proposal. They I should say, they wanted to execute it, and they masked it as the French proposal. French proposal, which in practice is a European proposal, as the professor says, and I've just made the commentary on, and is included in the protocol signed by all parties. Oh, I don't know what happened to the Macedonians signing such agreements. Obviously, we've heard previously professors saying that they really lacked knowledge and expertise and didn't consult with anybody. And they didn't know what they were signing. So anyway, we believe that this will be a difficult process, but with understanding and explanation, it will bring reassurance. End of quote. So that was the quotation that I gave you, which I'm just looking up to see. Yeah. So anyway, that was that quotation. Continuing on, basically this statement by the French ambassador, so it was the statement by the French ambassador, proved once again that EU and France couldn't grasp or understand the meaning and content of the category of sovereign cultural rights, or even concept of sovereign equality in general, or did they? I asked the question. Surprisingly, no one in Macedonia reacted to that disgraceful statement by the French ambassador Robin, which we've just mentioned earlier. For that statement and actual support for the ethnocide policies conducted by Bulgaria vis-a-vis Macedonia, the French ambassador Robin was decorated by the Bulgarian president Radev. Wow. They awarded him, they decorated him, they gave him the Order of the Madara on the 3rd of October 2022. Wow, he did a fine job representing the Bulgarians. Amazing. Ambassador Robin, assuming powers, all sorts of powers, and giving some kind of guarantee, these non-guarantees, what we call in Australian Clayton's guarantees. Clayton's. Look that up and you'll see what it means. It's an idiom used here in Australia. It's a Clayton's one. Clayton's. It should be noted that the French diplomacy in general have not taken into consideration more than a dozen judgments won by the Macedonians against the Bulgarian state decisions that proved to be illegal, delivered by the European Court of Human Rights. In addition, the French diplomacy should have known better that Bulgarian constitution does not recognize any national minorities at all, and that in international relations exists the principle of mutual reciprocity on such matters. I say that they do recognize, they do know, they're fully aware of these things, but they ignored them. Shockingly, the EU, German and French diplomats even did not know a basic historical fact related to the Bulgarian attempts and efforts to assimilate Macedonians into Bulgarians or by pro-fascist regime conducted during the Second World War, a simple historical fact known even from textbooks for high school students. Silvana commenting now, I believe they do know, they've always known. Yeah, they do know. They know the historical facts, but my question to them is, what are they afraid of? Why? All this jumping up and down and producing some kind of agreements concocted by the Bulgarians and siding with the Bulgarians, as they did side with the Hellenic state previously. But the professor rightfully points out that the Bulgarian constitution does not recognize any national minorities at all, and that in international relations exists this principle of mutual reciprocity on such matters. But sadly or shockingly, the EU, the German, the French diplomats even did not know a basic historical fact related to the Bulgarian attempts and efforts to assimilate Macedonians into Bulgarians by pro-fascist regime conducted during the Second World War, a simple historical fact known even from textbooks for high school students. And finally, the EU and the US diplomacy couldn't realize the basic idea of the imposed and forceful assimilation as a misconduct related to the constitutional revisions as EU conditions, i.e. to establish Bulgarians not as national minority, since they do not recognize minorities even in their own country, but rather as the constitutive nation in Macedonia. Yeah, constitutional revisions of that type planned and demanded by the EU would only entail that Macedonians as a nation were an artificial nation, never existed, and that all Macedonians were in fact originally Bulgarians. Wow. Haven't they read the Bible? Obviously not. They're talking about Macedonia in the Bible. They're not talking about Bulgaria. They're not talking about Greece. None of those countries existed, but there is references to Macedonia. Many, many references, and that Macedonia and its people still exist, despite the attempts of others, we know who, in trying to change their name, their identity, the name of the state, the history, and the ethnicity. As the professor says, Prespa Agreement is a cultural genocide of the Macedonian national identity. And that is a fact. We've got lots of evidence. We've been through 4 chapters already. We're on chapter 5, 5.2, and part 3 of that chapter. So there's a lot of evidence there. And it's not just Professor Igor Yanev who talks about it. Okay, so where were we? Finally, the EU and US diplomacy couldn't realize the basic idea of the imposed and forceful assimilation as a misconduct related to the constitutional revisions as EU conditions, that is to establish Bulgarians not as a national minority, since they do not recognize minorities even in their own country, but rather as the constitutional, as being the main nationals in Macedonia, which they're not, because there are hardly any of them. And why would they have such a status? Other ethnic groups in Macedonia don't have that status. Okay. And that all Macedonians were in fact originally Bulgarians. Well, that's not the case, never been the case and never will be. Thus, ethnocide European Union conditions would only entail that Macedonians were Bulgarians in the past, present, and in the future as well. No such success in that department. They can only wish, but it will not happen. In conclusion, the EU and the Western states and so-called international community, in fact, supported the extreme ethnocide Bulgarians' efforts for illegal Macedonian assimilation as a cultural genocide originally conducted by the Bulgarian fascist regime during the Second World War on Macedonian territory under the Bulgarian occupation. Similarly, with the Prespa Agreement, the PA is more than evident, namely Prespa Treaty, the PA nullified the existence of the Macedonian minority in Greece and therefore elsewhere as well on the grounds of non-recognition of their identity. These aspects of the Prespa Agreement or treaty is in sharp violation of the basic norms of international customary and codified law related to the protection of minorities abroad, as indicated previously. It appears that with the conclusion of the Prespa Agreement, Macedonian government did not only nullify the existence of the Macedonian minority in Greece and in the world, but based on dismissed and renounced national identity provisions in general, erga omnes, ethnic Macedonian national identity, erga omnes, was not recognized and therefore abolished even domestically as well. Yeah, doesn't look like there's anybody clever or wise, this so-called North Macedonia, artificial state. As indicated previously, the PA was an illegal act actually banning and prohibiting national identity to Macedonians, an identity that was entirely sold to Greek state nation by the puppet government in order to obtain a start for EU negotiations. Instead of recognizing and grasping a linkage between the two dubious identity treaties, that is the relationship between the Bulgarian treaty and the Greek one, that is the PA, and to advance proper question for referendum related to the termination of the PA as a number one priority, VMRO DPMNE, that is the opposition party, decided to put on the table for plebiscite only a weak question relating to the law of ratification of the Bulgarian treaty concluded in 2017. And finally, after the unlawful rejection of that initiative for referendum by the government, that is the Speaker of Parliament, the Jaferi person, VMRO lost any plan, idea, or strategy for solving the actual problems with treaties and overthrow the government that supported imposed assimilation on the people. Now, I think I should like to end it there, and we'll continue for another session where we are going to finish. I'm determined for us to complete the chapter 5, 2. So in the next segment, we will be completing chapter 2 in total with all its parts. So I'll leave you here for now. You've been listening to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, broadcasting from Melbourne, Australia. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing you very shortly. Bye for now.